operational. I was never here. By the time I came here, Louis Ginsberg and Alexander Marx, Avraham Shalom, were gone. And so I came here and inherited the stories about Marx and Ginsberg. And then when I was here, of course, we had Heschel, and we had Kaplan, and Dr. Finkelstein, Professor Lieberman, H.L. Ginsberg, we had Shalom Spiegel. We had our share of heroes, and we developed a mythology of them, which we told to each other late at night in the dormitory and around the tables in the dining room. And suddenly, we've discovered that for all of you, those stories are as forgotten as the Marx-Ginsberg stories were to us, and that you really did not know, and do not have the memories that we had of them. But every school has its own mythology, and this is an attempt to help perpetuate the specific mythology of our institution with specific reference to one of its great men, great scholars and teachers, the late Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose 25th Yahrzeit we will observe very shortly, January, early January. It's Shabbat Vayechi, which is, of course, appropriate enough that he should have died on Shabbat Vayechi, the parsha in which we record two great death scenes. Jacob dies and Joseph dies. But yet, the Shabbat in which they die is called Shabbat Vayechi because they're still very much alive. And Heschel is very much alive as well. We're going to show you clips from a one-hour interview that Heschel recorded with Carl Stern of NBC very shortly before he died. It was actually shown after his death. With Heschel, I have always felt that the persona is at least half the story. It's not only what he taught, but who he was, and how he presented himself. And it's very important for us to remember not only the books and not only the teaching, but also the man, the look, the style, the manner, and of course the stories. So I'm particularly thrilled that Mrs. Heschel is here with us to share this evening. I hope she will get pleasure from it as much as I know that the memories will be painful, but we're thrilled that you are here and are grateful that you came tonight. We're going to show pieces of the video, and then those of us who were here went with Heschel and were actually in class with him and sat around tables in this room with him and went to faculty meetings with him and were interviewed on the committee in admissions by him. We'll share some anecdotes, memories, and have, I hope, a lot of pleasure in the memories, and talk to each other and with each other and allow you to ask questions, and in this way help keep alive the memory of one of the seminary's great heroes. So we'll begin with the video, and then talk. By Kogen, Jules, Mr. Holtz, Morton. No set order, memories, anecdotes, jokes. David? Could you date yourselves in terms of Heschel?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Is this thing working? Yes.
The first thing I'd like to tell you is that when Professor Heschel came here in 1945, I was a senior in the rabbinical school. I did not have him in class. But I did meet him under rather unusual circumstances right in this building. We now have a Morton Leifman gymnasium, which is a new name for an old creature.
Leifman is quickly becoming an old creature.
What I meant by a creature was a gym. It still has the same low ceiling. How did I meet him in the gym?
Heschel was throwing baskets.
Heschel wanted to get exercise. He wanted to keep his weight down. And it didn't occur to me why at that time. Why would he suddenly be adding weight? But later I figured out that when he was at HUC, he was quite limited in what he could eat. Whereas when he came here, he was able to eat everything, and therefore put on some weight. So my first meetings with him were in the gym, where we both wore shorts, and I taught him a set of exercises called the Illini 11. This I owe to my former physical education courses, which were kind of minor in phys ed at one point. But then I left for Vancouver, Canada. And in Vancouver, we had a rather limited number of speakers on things Jewish. People in Vancouver knew Maurice Samuel, they knew Avraham Sacker, but that was about the extent of what they knew as lecturers. One year, this was in 1952, after having had my fill of Samuel and Sacker and a few others, I decided that it's time to bring out somebody from the seminary. And you know, those of you who are going to be rabbis are going to find that your colleagues will let you do almost anything if you do the work. How did we introduce Heschel to the West Coast? I spoke to the rabbis in Seattle and Portland and said, I'll make all the arrangements if you'll share the cost and you'll lecture in Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland. They agreed. Then I had to raise some money so that Heschel could be heard in Vancouver. And I went to the B'nai B'rith, who are known for their interfaith work, and to the Canadian Jewish Congress, who work together with B'nai B'rith in Vancouver and across Canada. And we brought in Heschel, and I wanted to make sure that he got to be known not only by the Jewish community, but at least by the ministers and people from the university. So I got the Canadian Jewish Congress and B'nai B'rith to give me a shpor d'isl geld. That means enough money to be able to handle this, so that I could invite all the ministers in whose churches I'd ever spoken and all my friends from the university. We came out there, we came to the lecture, and for the first time in Vancouver history, I don't know how it went elsewhere, but for the first time in Vancouver history, there was a discussion of the Holocaust. Heschel was asked by one of the ministers the equivalent of, how can you believe in God after Auschwitz? And he was able to handle himself very well, as you can expect. So on that trip, He made a terrific impression on the Jewish community and on the ministers and university people in Vancouver. The next day I took him out to Stanley Park, which is a beautiful sight. And Heschel looked out over his open space and flowers, and this is wintertime. Lots of flowers, lots of green. And he said to me, you know, if this kind of space had been available to people in Europe in the late 1930s, World War II could have been prevented. Policies of the United States and Canada were such that immigration was cut down and Europe had to explode in some way. There's a third thing I remember from that trip to Vancouver at Heschel, and that is how concerned he was for Sylvia. I'm glad you're here, Sylvia. At that time, Sylvia was pregnant with Susie, and it seemed to be that every half hour, Heschel was phoning her to find out how she is, what's doing, how are you, is everything all right? He was a very concerned husband, as he was a devoted father also after Susie was born. Let me share with you an insight of mine connected with Heschel on the admissions committee of the medical school. Heschel asked questions. He put the student, the future student, through the ringer, but never said, take this fellow, don't take this fellow. He left the judgment to the members of the committee, unlike certain other senior members of the medical school who, when chairing the meeting, always made sure that they pushed for people they wanted. On a more personal note, I remember that Heschel used to take walks with my father-in-law, Rabbi Michael Rosenblum, who was also a chassid. My father-in-law was a Gerach chassid. Heschel was not. He had his own brand of chassidus. But they discussed stories about Rabbeim, and I was always interested to walk along and listen, because they had plenty to say. Two more pictures. One Friday night, my son Avi and I went out for a walk after dinner, and we met Professor Heschel in the street. Heschel was about this tall, and Avi was about this tall. And Heschel looked up to Avi and he said, tell me, Avi, what do you want to be when you grow up? And Avi said to him, I want to be a rabbi. Heschel said, and he said, that's wonderful. That's the best thing I heard this week. And he really felt, Avi felt 10 feet high. One more thing, and that is a picture of the seminary in those days. The picture that sticks in my mind is the picture of the seminary synagogue in the Unterberg Auditorium. Front row, Louis Finkelstein, Saul Lieberman, Max Artz, Simon Greenberg. Second row, Heschel, H.L. Ginsberg, Spiegel, Kadushin, and Zucker. You looked at that picture, it was a powerful statement of a powerful seminary.
I'm a few years younger than Rabbi Kogen, but I came here as an undergraduate student. So Rabbi Kogen, who then was known as Clark Gable Kogen. It really looked very much like Clark Gable in those years. I came, David was still a student, but I got here before Heschel did. And when Heschel came, as I guess you could have inferred from something that David said, Heschel was still a bachelor. And Heschel moved into the dormitory. And we had a remarkable group of people in the dormitory for a number of years. And some of us developed very interesting relationships with professors. So we were young. I was an undergraduate student. Heschel, of course, was a complicated person. And his friendships were complicated. His closest friends in the younger generation were Sam Dresner and Wolf Kellman. And the relationship was different with each of those young people. Sam Dresner had been a student at Hebrew Union College when Heschel was there. And Heschel changed Dresner's life quite completely. Dresner came from a Reform background. His teacher and idol was Felix Levy, who was a Reform rabbi in Chicago, and by the way, the father of Jackie Kellman. And Felix Levy, Al Shalom, had two students, great students. One was Sam Dresner. The other was his nephew, Arnie Wolf. Some of you know Rabbi Arnie Wolf. Eventually, Wolf Kellman married Felix Levy's daughter. That's a different geschäft. But Dresner's life was completely changed by his relationship with Heschel. And when Heschel left Hebrew Union College, Dresner followed him and came here. And the relationship of Rebbe and Chassid remained not only through Heschel's lifetime, but even past Heschel's lifetime. Dresner still talks about Heschel as his Rebbe with affection and respect and really quite great beauty. With Wolf Kellman, it was very different, and I think perhaps I want to tell you the story of how they met. Wolf came to the seminary directly from the Canadian Air Force. He came here right after the war wearing the uniform of the Canadian Air Force and came, took his entrance exams, got into class here very, very quickly, kind of under the door, as it were, because admissions committee meetings were all over already, and he had to really fight just to take those tests. He was admitted, put into improper classes because he was a great Talmud Chacham already at that time. He was put in at beginning classes, and it didn't take too long before he was very disillusioned with the seminary and wanted to leave. Dresner had befriended Kellman, and Dresner said, "You're not going to leave. You have to talk to Heschel." And Kellman said, "Well, Heschel. Heschel is a Hasidic little Rebbe who went to Warsaw and then to Berlin to become educated. What do I have to tell Heschel? What does he have to tell me? I'm not going to go see Heschel. I'm leaving." Dresner then made an appointment for Kellman to see Heschel, and Heschel left a note in Kellman's box saying, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, come to my office. Kellman was ready to kill Sam Dresner, but he appeared at Heschel's office. Heschel was on the telephone. Mrs. Heschel will testify that Heschel spent a lot of time on the telephone. And he's talking on the phone, and Kellman is sitting there. Heschel's talking on the phone. Kellman picks up a book, opens the book, a book that was on Heschel's desk, begins to read it. 10 minutes later, 50 minutes later, Heschel finishes his phone call and says to Kellman, "You know that book?" And Kellman smiles and says, "Yes, I know the book very well." Heschel says, "How do you know that book so well?" Kellman says, "My grandfather wrote it." Heschel says, "Your grandfather? How are you related to this man?" Kellman says, "My father was the din of Iran. My grandfather was the din of Iran." Heschel looks at him and says, "Excuse me, young man. What's the grandson of the din of Iran doing at the Jewish theologian?" To which Kellman said, "I'll answer that, sir, if you tell me what the grandson of the Ohev Yisrael is doing at." At which point Heschel jumped up and embraced him. And that relationship was very different from the Dresner-Heschel relationship. And I'm not chas v'shalom saying anything but good things about both of those relationships. But with Gillman and Heschel, it was not only disciple and rebbe, but comrade. Isn't that right, Sylvia?
Yes.
They were close friends who shared everything. Everything. Now, in those days, every seminary student had to spend 2 years working as a clerk to a professor. We did that in lieu of paying tuition. That was kind of remarkable. Tuition was free. See? But I was told I had to spend a year with any 2 professors that were willing to accept me. So the first year I spent with Mordechai Menachem Kaplan Al-Shal. And that was a life-changing experience. He had me doing research. He taught me research techniques. He had me to his house a number of times a week. And it was a remarkable experience. Gillman and Dresner got a hold of me 2 years later and said, okay, you got to do a second one. It's got to be with Heschel. And I made an appointment, and we began working together. And I don't know what Dr. Heschel expected of me, because after all, I was a friend of Gillman's and Dresner's. Gillman was my closest friend till the day he died. And Sam Dresner and I are very close friends, classmates. I don't know what he expected of me, and I don't know what I expected of him. But we were both disappointed. We were both disappointed. We never really, at that point, got what we expected out of that relationship. And all right, things never gelled, and at one point, my disappointment was such that I figured, fine, at the end of the year, come out and go. And then I became a senior. And we rarely saw each other. And remember, I was awfully young. And I must admit, foolish. Foolish. And came my senior sermon. And I decided to be cutesy. And I wrote a sermon in an attempt, first of all, to copy Heschel's style. Meshuggah. Copy his style. I wrote alliterative sentences. I wrote stuff which I thought was poetic. And then, terribly, foolishly, I kind of attacked Heschel's philosophy. But I never mentioned his name in the sermon. And in the middle of the sermon, I said to myself, idiot, you fool. You've shamed yourself. You've embarrassed yourself. You said silly, foolish things in front of all of your professors. He named them. But he forgot Alexander Marx and Louis Ginsburg, who were also sitting in the front row. Boy, these were the Gedolei Hador. It wasn't just Lieberman was plenty, but you had Ginsburg and Marx sitting there. All I wanted to do was disappear. I wanted the earth to open up and cover me over. That didn't happen, but what did happen is that as soon as the last Kaddish was said, I ran. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as I could, and I got to the door. And when I got to the door, I felt an arm on my shoulder. And I turned around. And who was there? Elio Hanovi. The Lubavitcher Rebbe. Heschel b'chvodo atzmo. And he turned me around and he said, Morty, I have to talk to you. He said, I want you to know, Morty, that there are preachers who, when they preach to tailors, to Schneiders, they talk about the sins of Schusters, shoemakers. And when they preach to shoemakers, they talk about the sins of Balikolis, teamsters. Morty, dear, that's not your style of thought. You talk directly into the kishkes. Guys, the kishkes of the people sitting right in front of you. Never lose that ability, son. That's a wonderful ability to talk into the kishkes of the people sitting right in front of you. And he hugged me, and he kissed me. You know what that did? First, it saved the relationship. We became very good friends. Very good friends indeed. Secondly, to some degree, it saved my self-respect. Of course, I was a jerk. But he didn't say it to me. He didn't say it to me. He saved my self-respect, and he saved the friendship. Years later, Wolf Kellman got very sick. I'm not talking about his last illness. For his last illness. And Heschel didn't know where to turn. And at that point, we took long walks together. I used to do that with Wolf. Mostly our walks were across the park from 114th Street, where the Heschels lived, to Mount Sinai Hospital. We'd walk back and forth and we'd talk. We'd talk. We'd cry a little bit. We'd talk. We'd talk about relationship to students. Talk about relationship to the world. We'd talk about his family, talk about my family. And very often I would say to myself, what if he wouldn't have run after me and put his hand on my shoulder, turned me around, and said, don't lose that ability. I would have been a lesser person. The seminary is a phenomenal place. My closest relationship with faculty was not with Dr. Heschel, interestingly enough. It was with Shalom Spiegel and Boaz Cohn, Aleichem HaShalom, from which I learned a tremendous amount. But with Heschel, there was a kind of love that he could inspire, despite the fact that each of us knew pretty much what the lax in the other guy was. Isn't that wonderful? To be able to love, even when you know that the Zulat, the other guy, has a little bit clay in his feet. Hell, we're all human. And that's the greatness of this place, really. There's no one big Rebbe. There's a composite Rebbe here. We choose a little bit of each of those people that we revere, and we make our own Rebbe in the image that's important for us. I think Heschel would have enjoyed that, knowing that I could say, I loved him, even with the imperfections that all of us have.
Heschel, colleagues, students, friends. I came to the seminary in 1951, and that was a few years after Professor Heschel came to the seminary. I think he came in 46. 46. I remember Professor Heschel before he got his beard. I think he got the beard in 52, which was a year after I came. If you want to see that picture, there's a picture in one of the Masoret magazines the last couple of years. So that has the picture of him still without the beard.
Also on the jacket of Man is Not Alone.
The jacket of Man is Not Alone, right. That would be the place. I have to say, I'm honored, especially honored to be at this evening. I didn't have really a personal relationship with Professor Heschel when he was alive. And, I took one class with him, this class in the Kuzari, the Yehuda Halevi class. I remember him mainly from bumping into him in the elevator. The seminary elevator was a great place, and he would see me there, he would say, how are you, Mr. I'd say, Lukinsky. And he'd say, oh yes, Mr. Lukinsky. You know, and that is Mr. Gillman every time. I was not memorable, I guess. And there were, I also remember him mainly at that time from the Seudah Shlishit. My most powerful memory, I think in recent years, and this is how I have become involved. I've been more involved with Professor Heschel's life since his death than I was at the time when I was a student. Since his death, I've developed a series of workshops that I've given as a course at the seminary, at the KH conference, in various places, perhaps dozens of times, which is an attempt to apply the approach to journal writing of the psychologist Ira Pergoff. And I've also been writing a play on his life for the last 15 years. Mrs. Heschel keeps asking me, when are we going to see the play? Finally, I gave a first draft performance of it without a text off the top of my head at my high holiday position this year in Richland, Washington. I stayed for the whole 10 days, and one night I decided I'm going to do it. And I did. I don't play the part of Professor Heschel in the play. That was the breakthrough when I decided to base the play on an actual incident that took place when I was in the rabbinate at Kiev, Israel, in Brookline, Massachusetts. One January, we invited Professor Heschel to speak to the congregation. And it was a fundraising event, so we had 800 people sitting in the synagogue who had paid to hear Professor Heschel speak. And it was January. We should have thought of that in advance. And the 800 people in Boston, and 800 people were sitting there, and we got a phone call that the plane was delayed, and he would be at least an hour late. And Rabbi Saltzman, Zichrono, and I, we didn't know what to do, so we told the congregation, we said, please, it's worth waiting. If anyone wants his money back, we can have the money back, but it's worth waiting, please stay. And then we just waited, but I used that incident for the play. The play is based on this idea that what if we just hadn't sat there? What if I had come up and said, well, while we're waiting, let me tell you a little bit about Professor Heschel. And that's the premise of the play, and that's how it's worked out. So over the years, I've collected lots of stories that I've used in the workshop. The workshop is based on the idea that in Professor Heschel's biography, there are many places which are, I don't know about the new biography, there's a new one being written. And Sam Resner has been collecting material and preparing this new biography with him. At Kaplan, yeah. I understand that one volume is already ready, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. But in the materials that already exist, there are many, many spots which allow for the imagination to enter and to try to figure out what happened. There is, for example, I know that we're told that when he was a teenager, 17 years old, he left Warsaw to enter a secular gymnasium in Vilna. And the biographical materials up to now are just reported as a fact, but then in the workshop, the question is asked, like, how did he get there? How does a Hasidic kid, can you imagine the son of the Sutler Rebbe goes off to Harvard? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It seems very strange. And so in the workshop, the students who participate enter that moment. They try to make that moment come to life in the imagination. At the beginning, there's a lot of projection involved. The person's writing about himself, but then gradually, as you keep getting into the book, the thing comes alive, and you begin to at least tip the scales, and you start to enter perhaps the thinking of Heschel's life. One of my students was in the course at the seminary, was a Jew by choice, a convert. And at the end of the course, they had to pick one section of the journal that they were writing and edit it and give it to me as a kind of a final paper. They could edit it any way they want because there's a lot of personal stuff in it. And she picked that incident, the choice of going to Vilna to study at the secular gymnasium. And of course, she had made an analogous, it's not the same kind of a choice, but it was an analogous choice in becoming Jewish and coming to the seminary and studying here. When I read her paper, I said, you have it. I think that's about as close, and until more material becomes available, that's about as close, I think, as anybody can come to understanding the feelings at that moment. I wanted to, my own field is education. I said, well, the limitations of time. I thought, I've been collecting stories, and as I say, I want to give you some that relate to Heschel as a teacher. This story was told me by my friend and colleague, Bob Abramson. who was actually in the class when it happened. It's a remarkable story. Heschel once came to the class, and he had this way of teaching by indirection. Sometimes he would come at it from a particular angle, and you'd have to think afterwards, what did he mean? You know, and you'd sort of ponder it, and after you'd be walking down the street, you'd say, oh yeah, he must have meant that. I remember, just before I tell Bob Abrams' story, I remember once in class, in a Kuzari class, he was talking about Maimonides. And he said, Maimonides wrote the Morton Lukinsky in Arabic. And then he paused, and he said, can you imagine the Gaon of Vilna writing something in Polish? And everybody laughed. It seemed very... I went out and I said, what was he saying? What did he mean? You know, after a while, it began to dawn. He was making in a very pithy way, I think he was making a comparison between two cultures. It wasn't a critique of the Rama. I mean, Heschel wrote a biography of the Rama, so John was very important to him. He was giving you a thumbnail sketch of a way that you'll never forget, a comparison between two different cultures. The story that Bob Abrams told me was a story. He came into class, and Bob is about 6 or 7 years after me at the seminary. And I guess a little bit longer, in the early 60s. And he started the class, he said, gentlemen, is gelatin kosher or treif? So that was the time when Rabbi Isaac Klein had written the tshuva for the law committee of the RA on that very question. And he had decided that gelatin was kosher. And it's a very complicated thing about Avraham and that when the bones become a chemical, the animal bones become a chemical, and a chemical, it's Avraham. But it was very controversial at the time. When we look back now, it seems kind of, who eats jello? But it was that was like very only emotional mom. And the students, jumped right in and they're fighting back and forth. And this one says it's kosher, this one says it's straight, this one they're fighting back and forth, discussion, struggle, debating. Goes on, Heschel lets him go on, doesn't say a word for several minutes, and then all of a sudden the talk dies down, and he says, gentlemen, the hydrogen bomb, kosher, gentlemen, the hydrogen bomb, kosher or treif? And then there's a silence, and everybody realizes how ridiculous the previous discussion was. It was kind of a method. And the time goes fast, I just wanted to tell, I was going to read this next thing, but this is a story that I always tell in the workshops. And Mrs. Heschel tells me she doesn't think it ever happened. But it's a great story anyhow. And from understanding his methods of teaching, it could have happened. It's a story that Pinchas Peli tells. Pinchas Peli, Zichrono Livracha, was Heschel's student and friend. Peli came to America. He had been out of the academic world for a long time. He came to America to Dropsy College to work for his doctorate. And one night, as Peli tells the story, I have to tell it his way. I was going to read it, but I'll tell it. Peli, Professor and Mrs. Heschel invited the Pelis for Shabbos Friday night for dinner. And after dinner, the women were talking in the front room, and Heschel said, come into my study at about 11 o'clock. I want to talk to you about your doctorate. So they entered this Professor Heschel's study, and he said, what are you writing about for your doctorate? He says, well, I've been collecting the Ugaritic words in the Talmud. So I have the feeling that there's certain things that come up in the Talmud that the rabbis couldn't have said without understanding Ugaritic, without having known Ugaritic words. So Professor Heschel said, well, how many Ugaritic words have you found so far? He says, well, I've got about 4 or 5 of them now. And Heschel said, how many do you hope to have? I said, well, I'm looking, I hope, if I'm lucky, maybe I can get 10 or 11. So Heschel said, that's a wonderful idea for a doctor. Let's have a schnapps and drink to the Ugaritic words in the Talmud. So they treat him. And then he says, and Heschel says that maybe you'll find 15. Let's have another shot. We're going to find to the 15 Ugaritic words. The Talmud, so at this time, Holly begins to get suspicious. He thinks that Heschel is putting him on. And then it goes on, he says, and then Heschel says, well, this must be your life's dream to write this dissertation. He says, no, it's not exactly my life's dream, Professor, but you know, I have to get a union card. A PhD is a union card. I want to get into the academic world. He says, well, that's true. He said, let's drink a l'chaim to the union card. It goes on and on and on. It's worth reading. It's written in a little volume that Jules gave her at a conference that was held on in the West Coast and around White. It did have it?
Yeah, I think it could have
Could
happened.
have. In the end, the end of the story is that Heschel completely turns it around and he writes a doctorate on tefillah, which is what he really wanted to write, on tefillah, prayer.
Too close to the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. Have you missed most of the time? He ends by writing, he writes the dissertation on tefillah, and on Sunday morning, the very next Sunday, he comes to Heschel's office, and Heschel calls Professor Schwab in Chicago, and he gets Professor Leifman, and they set up, he says, it's the strangest committee ever created on the spot, you know. And he gets the credits transferred from Dropsy, and I don't remember if he got it here or he got it here, so he gets the credits are transferred from Dropsy. The whole thing was arranged, and Kelly says he thought that Professor Heschel was someone who didn't know how to work a telephone. Didn't know how to dial a phone. And then the next part was in the supervision of his doctorate. He tells the story that he would give Professor Heschel a chapter, and then he would go to see him, and Heschel would say, I was studying the most interesting thing this morning. Let's study it together. I want to teach it to you. So they would study, and then he would say, then he would tell him something that happened at a recent lecture, and then they would talk, and then after about 2 hours, Kelly would say, what about the chapter? So he said, well, do you like the chapter that you wrote? He said, well, I think there's a few changes I can make. He said, well, go back and make the changes, and then you'll bring it to me. After he gets out, he's sitting in the library, and he realizes that everything that they talked about in 2 hours was about his chapter. So that was, so that it was just a way of presenting it. I'm going to finish in a minute. I just want to tell, David Kogen told the story about Heschel as athlete. And that reminded me of a story that recently, I guess, because of the involvement that I've had in his life with these workshops and play, I had a call from a sculptor, Boris Spivak, a couple of years ago. And I guess he got my name because he heard that I was working on Heschel's life. And he asked me, it was the strangest question. He said, is Heschel, he's got a commission to do a life-size sculpture of Professor Heschel for a millionaire in Texas who has an estate filled with life-size sculptures of people that he admires, including Major League Baseball players. So, all kinds of very famous people and Major League players. So the question that he wants to know, and of course I didn't know the answer, but I directed him to Mrs. Heschel and Sam Dresner and Fritz Rothschild. I thought maybe one of them would know. He said, was Heschel right-handed or left-handed? So I said, well, I didn't say this, but I thought afterwards I should have said this. I should have said he bats left and throws right. I wanted to end with this one. There's so much. There's so much more. You have lots of other speakers, but one of the most memorable things about Heschel was Heschel's Nigun, and that I always feel bad that at the seminary that Nigun is forgotten. It's not said. It's not sung. Maybe at people's homes, but it's not sung here at the seminary, if I'm not mistaken. Is it? No. So I thought maybe we could renew the Nigun. I would teach you the Nigun, but I have to be helped by Marty Leifman. It has 2 parts. 3 parts. The second part is similar to the first, but you have to get it up a higher notch, take it up a notch. And I'll sing the line, and then you sing it with me, and then maybe when the evening is over, we can sing it again. I think this was a love story, Nigun, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't think so.
You don't think so? But this was identified with Heschel, right? Whatever the source was, whenever I think of Heschel, I mean, sometimes it's a enigma that runs through your head, you can't stop, it doesn't stop. It's a wonderful enigma, and since I thought of the idea, so I'll do it. It goes like this. I'll do a line in. Okay, first do that. Then we used to sing, we never did this when he was present, but we used to, in the last slide, we used to sing it according to the book titles. The earth is the Lord's, 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 the earth is the Lord's. And then we would sing good Shabbos to you, good Shabbos to you, so forth and so on. Man's not alone. If you want to do one more time, just say
Let's start from the beginning.
No, that's the last part.
Dr. Heschel actually taught it not with die, but na, and many of the students used to call it Heschel's negative niggun.
Mrs. Heschel. I came to New York City and the seminary and a different Medina and a different life from Sioux City, Iowa in 1953. I came to a great extent because of Dr. Heschel, whose book, Man Is Not Alone, I read several times on my grandparents' porch swing. It was an experience unlike any I had ever had before. Heschel's classes and music. We were assigned a book of medieval Jewish philosophy by an extraordinary thinker, Isaac Husik, H-U-S-I-K. It's dry as dust. Dr. Heschel, in giving the assignment, said, "Gentlemen, I must warn you, there is no music in music." I was privileged to have seminars with Dr. Heschel, one in Shnei Luchot HaBrit, very difficult text, and this was during one of the several months when I was convinced this is too much for me and I have to leave the seminary. Walking on Broadway, down Broadway and back up Broadway and down Broadway and back Broadway, I was pouring my heart out and saying what a dope I am, I'll never understand. He said, "You will understand," and he said, it was so kind, "I'm very suspicious of people who mature very early." That was sweet. And only in later years did I realize the man who said that, at the age of 18, I believe, published an extraordinarily beautiful book of Yiddish poetry. Three other things. When, after I was ordained, the seminary was afraid to let me loose on the congregation, and so I stayed to work for the Rabbinical Assembly. It was a great privilege to be with Dr. Heschel's friend and colleague, and my friend and colleague, Wolf Kellman, Nishmato Aiden, and I was on the same floor, 6th floor, with Dr. Heschel, around on the other building. He was excited when he was writing. He was like a kid. Writing, said, come here and listen to this, listen to this. Called me on the phone. I wasn't the only one he called. Called me on the phone, listen to that. He was writing in Yiddish, his volumes, 2 volumes on the Kotzker Rebbe. And he would write about maybe 6, 8 lines, like quadruple space on a sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. I remember one of those exciting times. I remember the last line, which is typical again of his use of paradox and opposites and so forth. The last line was, "The peacock looks at its feet and weeps." I used to talk to him a lot of time, pouring my heart out, saying it. Here we are at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Dr. Heschel is at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Jules Harlow is editing a prayer book. He said, "You are able to do that because you have different people looking over your shoulder from your family." When I worked on the High Holiday Muffs, the last thing that I did in the manuscript was to write about 10 or 12 pieces which I thought were the most elegant, profound, succinct introductions to each section of the prayer book that ever existed. I was very pleased with them, but I had sense enough to want to show them to somebody else. So I asked that they were to appear on the half titles throughout the volume. And I asked Dr. Heschel if he would read them and respond to them, and he said he would. And so I brought this treasure to his office, and I didn't hear from him for about 2 months. Another month goes by, finally I can't wait anymore. I call him up and I ask him about it. He said, "Oh, certainly, come over to my office," made an appointment, came over to his office, sat down. This was the time when some people smoked. Dr. Heschel loved to smoke cigars. And I had visions of the Baal Shem, rising from one heaven to another as he smoked. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "There was a woman in a certain district in Poland, doesn't matter which district. She made the best gefilte fish in that whole district. Not only in that district, she made the best gefilte fish in all of Poland. And every Erev Shabbos, every Friday, that's all she did. She made her fabulous gefilte fish. And one Friday morning, she tasted it, but she went along. She tasted a little here, and so she needed a little more of this, and took out some of this maybe. It didn't taste just right this particular Erev Shabbos. Well, it doesn't matter. She can go to the store and get some more fish. Oh, the store's closed. It's too late. Also, she tried to put in this spice and that. It still didn't taste just right. It's a disaster. Because how can she have people at her table on Shabbos and not served her fabulous gefilte fish? On the other hand, if she served this fish, it'd be the end of her reputation. She'd be ashamed. So so what did she do? She threw out the gefilte fish. And he was right.
I had Dr. Heschel as a friend, teacher from the time I was about 15. And I remember I came to him, I was terribly depressed. I was suffering a great spiritual anguish. I thought I was an atheist. And I came to Dr. Heschel. I said, "Dr. Heschel, I think I'm an atheist. What do I do?" He says, "Read Heidegger." which is difficult, because it was difficult. And another time, my sister studied with him, and she didn't do too well with him. And came the end term, and she goes to blank. So he says, Sylvia, this is a strange examination I'm going to give you. Go next door and play me a Chopin. Play me Chopin. That's the most creative examination ever given at the seminar. Play me a Chopin. You'd like an examination like that, huh? Now, yeah.
Should I tell you what he said to me? He wished that his daughter and everybody would study under you. Those were his words to me.
Well, there's a story from an entrance examination. Tell me, Mr. So-and-so, if you went to the North Pole, what did you take with you? My Thomas and Tillin, sir. And a warm coat you wouldn't take with me? Then he told me when he had his heart attack, I went in to his office and tried to distract him. Mr. Heschel, let me take you to the movies. No, I can't do it. I'm working on the book on the Kutzker. It's for your health that I'm taking you to the movies. No. Then he told me a story about when he was 14, he had a Rebbe who taught him. And when the lesson was over, the Rebbe said, why don't you go out and play with the other little boys? And Heschel said, oh, no. The Rebbe said, told him this story. Once there was a young Rebbe like you who had a Rebbe like me. And after he was finished with the lesson, he would get on a goat and ride around the town on the goat. So they say, teaching him, you know, everybody's got a goat that he has to ride. If you don't ride it now, you'll ride it when you're 60 when it won't look so good. That's profound insight. You remember that one?
Remember that?
Yeah. I remember I used to spend Shabbosim at your house, and I'd come after the davening was over. And I remember staying till 1 o'clock in the morning, studying Kassir. He loved Kassir. He had notebooks from Kassir's lectures. And what I loved about Dr. Heschel is that he combined culture with Yiddishkeit. And nobody else did that. And not to the same degree. And I remember folding up an old sock and playing baseball with the old sock on your living room with Susie being the catcher. By the way, baseball is a very important aspect of the seminary curriculum. Joe Lukinsky brings Heschel in from baseball. Simon Greenberg has a whole chapter on baseball in his book of theology. So, this is backhanded teaching. It's not directed. It's in the what's the word? It's indirective. It's non-directive education. Wait a second. Yeah. Oh, yeah. One day we were in Shabbos, I remember we were sitting around the table, and you had read an article about camp travelers in the American Army. And you said to Heschel, there can't be such things. And he looked at you and he says, Sylvia, have you never heard of loneliness?
Camp followers.
Camp followers. Whores. You remember that?
Yes.
Sylvia, don't
That
you?
very sentence.
Do you remember? Have you never heard of loneliness?
Yeah,
So I remember correctly.
absolutely.
Good. Okay, enough of that.
I came to the seminary from another kind of environment, from the Zionist Hebraic schools, and in those days we had to have an interview before we were accepted to what was then called the pre-Theo program. And the name Heschel was totally unknown. I didn't have an idea. So when I came into the room, I wasn't at all awestruck. I'll come back to that later. And each one in turn asked a question, and I remember Professor Heschel's question very, very well. He said to me, Mr. Holtz, let us assume that you are already ordained. You know that the Lubavitcher Rebbe just died. Do you think you could fill his shoes? Absolutely, let's say almost idiotic. And I said, well, this is the school, what difference does it make what I say? So I answered, well, Professor, I wasn't born into the right family. He said, so you do know something about Hasidus. A few years later, he had to come for another interview. And he said to me, well, we know about your transcript and so on, and we know about you, we've come to know you a little bit. Could you tell me what you think about putting shoes in the Yoren Kodesh? We talked about left field, non-directive. I said, Professor, it's absurd. He said, perfect answer. Little did I know that was in one of his books. I hadn't read the book at the time, and this was exactly the kind of absurdity that he was talking about. A few years later, I'm already teaching here, and it's my turn for tenure decision. I'm up for tenure. I had already applied to other institutions because I was quite certain that I wasn't going to receive tenure here. And as it went, the rest is obvious. I did receive tenure. However, the rule was, and still is, that no person on that committee is ever supposed to let you know the decision of that committee. And at that time, it was Dr. Finkelstein. I was supposed to wait for Dr. Finkelstein's letter. But Professor Heschel apparently couldn't wait. And at that time, I had an office in that building that was demolished over there. And he calls me up on the telephone, and we spoke to each other in Yiddish. And he said, "Kim Arav." So I come over to his room, and he said, "Sit down." So I sit down, and now I quote, "Du sollst wissen sein, du bist da reingefallen zwischen goinische Ketten. Aber mir darfen sich hiten den Schummes." I want you to know that you have entered into a place of phenomenal minds. But we, I think he meant, we Galicianer, we Polish Jews, have to protect, defend, heed, care for our souls. He didn't say anything, did he? He didn't tell me that I was granted tenure. But of course I went home fully satisfied that I had received tenure. I knew at that point that I had become a member of the faculty. As a result of which, our friendship developed. And at one point I was invited, it must have been about 1970 or so, I was invited for 10 days, I think it was Yocheved or Yocheved's organization, that invited me to teach in a Judeo-Christian institute. I went to public schools, but I had never spent 10 days with fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters. And to be honest, I was somewhat reluctant. So where do you go? I took the letter to Professor Heschel. And he said again, "Sit down." He said, "You were very disturbed, as I was, that in 1967, weeks before the Six-Day War, the Christian world, the Catholic world didn't understand. The Catholic world didn't come to our help." Well, Avraham Holtz, how much time did you put into teaching the Christian world what the state of Israel means to us, what the city of Jerusalem means to us, what we experienced during the Holocaust? I said, "Nitzachtan, I'm going." And he said, "Besides which, who do you think recommended you?" Well then, we can go on, and I will tell you just one or two stories from the admissions committee. I'm already on the other side. I'm one of the people sitting on the committee, and Professor Heschel was sitting at the end of the table. The chairman sat, and in walks this young man, looks at Professor Heschel, and is dumbstruck. Cannot utter a syllable. Could hardly find a chair to sit down. He sat down, and Professor Heschel immediately spotted that this poor fellow was having some kind of problem. And he said, "Excuse me, sir, what university do you go to?" No response. "Sir, where were you born?" No response. "Sir, how old are you?" No response. He said, "You know, I think you're having problems. Perhaps you and I should change places." Well, I don't know what to say. The young man today is a rabbi, but at that point I thought that it was rather strange. He got up. The young man got up, and Heschel had no choice. And they young man is now in the chairman's position. Heschel is in the student seat. So the young man says to Heschel, can you tell me what you're doing at the seminary? And Professor Heschel understood that we all had to laugh because this was an unusual scene. He said, I'm here because I want to be very close to my colleague Avraham Holtz. And of course, everybody in the room began to laugh, I included, and then we were able to go on with the interview.
He knew his name?
I know his name. They tell a story about Professor Heschel, who, when he came to Israel, everybody in Israel is either an archaeologist, or an archaeologist in training, or a novice, just beginning to be an archaeologist. And they wanted Professor Heschel very much to meet an archaeologist, and Professor Heschel was not so excited about meeting an archaeologist. So finally he said, okay, I'll meet an archaeologist. So they introduce him to an archaeologist. And he says, Mr. Archaeologist, I have only one question to ask. If you found the 10 Commandments, would you keep them? I was teaching in the prose dorm. And one day, it was early in the morning, it was about 9:20 or 9:25 in the morning. And Professor Heschel comes in. He said, you must come upstairs right away. He looked at it as if he had been on some kind of airplane problem or something. Completely, seemed to me, disoriented, disturbed. He said, Professor, I have to go to class. It's no problem. I'll go with you to class. I'll tell the students that you must come up with me now, and you'll leave the class. So he comes to class, tells the students, he's coming with me. He'll be right down. We're going upstairs. Come upstairs. He says, I need your help. Professor Heschel needs my help. I said, what about? He says, well, I was in a congregation. I just come from that congregation now, and I don't know what to do. I said, what happened? He said, instead of sitting on the bema, I decided to sit in the congregation. And I lifted my eyes. It was a magnificent synagogue. And I saw the 10 Commandments, and one of them said, Lo yeh lecha Elohim. You should have no God. They left out one word. So what should I do? What should I tell them that they have to correct that? It doesn't seem to bother anybody. You think the rabbi knows about it? And he goes on and on like this, and I said, Professor, what could you do? Well, anyway, he wrote a letter. And what happened, I don't know if it was ever corrected or not. Last story, the impact of, pardon? After Professor Heschel's death, we all accepted invitations to different speaking engagements that Professor Heschel had. And this one was particularly unique. Mrs. Heschel accompanied me to some place outside of Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. Outside of Philadelphia. And for the first time in all of the years that I've been teaching public groups, I was teaching, and the sisters, this was in a convent, the sisters were mouthing. Their mouths were going. And it was very distracting. At the end of this experience, I went over to the Mother Superior and I said, could you explain what was happening? she said, our sisters have memorized Heschel's writings.
Oh, no.
And they were following you, word by word. And then we were taken into a room, and each sister had made a wall hanging of the line in Heschel which most impressed her. This was an unforgettable experience. Thank you.
I came here in '54. Avraham, you were '54?
Yeah,
Same year?
same, about the same.
'54. And I never had the kind of friendship with Heschel that my older contemporaries did. By the time I came here, he was legendary. He was a mythic figure. We did not approach him to schmooze, at least he never invited that from me. I never felt presumptuous enough to suggest that I should do it. So our relationship, first as a student, and then later when I joined the administration, and then when I joined the faculty, was distant. Very powerful snippets of memory. The longest cigar I had ever seen. Sitting at the far right-hand corner of the cafeteria with a cup of coffee that replenished itself. Endless lunch. The three other chairs around the table, people came and went, and he sat. And there was always 3 other people or 4 other people around. He drank his endless cup of coffee, and people talked, and he talked. And he told stories, and any one paragraph there could be, this is what Martin Luther King said to me yesterday in Bobby Kennedy's office, called about this, and the Upter Rebbe said this once upon a time, and you should see what I read in the New Republic, and it was the range and the breadth and the width of the learning was all that was on the table all the time. Committee on Admissions. Mr. Gillman, this was the first time I ever laid eyes on him. I had done a paper in my applications essay. I had said that I was trying to make a case for their admitting me. So I had said that I had done a paper on the Jewish concept of man. Walk in, Simon Greenberg, beloved Shalom, was the chair of the committee. Simon and I sit down, and there's Heschel, and I'm absolutely paralyzed. I'd never expected him to be on the committee of admissions. I thought he was beyond that. There he was, and Greenberg says, Professor Heschel will ask the first question. And he looks at me and just says, tell me, Mr. Gillman, what is the difference between the Jewish and the Christian concepts of man? That was how it all began, And I don't know whether he asked it to put me on the spot or he asked it because he knew that I had written on it and that I had something to say on it. So I don't know whether this was an act of charity on his part or grace or an act of, testing my mettle. The best anecdote of all, and some of my students have heard this already. Heschel taught at 9 o'clock in the morning. I believe it was Monday mornings from 9 to 9:50. Sort of the graveyard shift for academicians. Those classes I felt were a burden. Those were the required classes. 2 semesters, 2 spring semesters, 1 semester in the cycle. 1 semester he taught Rambam, the other semester he taught Halevi. Classes always met from 9 to 9:50. By the time he got there, by the time we got there, by the time he called the roll, by the time he reviewed the recent events in the Vietnam story or the Martin Luther King story, we got to the Rambam somewhere around 20 after 9, and by 9:50 the class was over. The great teaching experience was not in that class, but in the elective seminar, where he was at his best. We all had to take elective seminars, and there he would sit for 3-4 hours at a shot at night in the green room, what is now the green room, used to be the boardroom, with coffee, and of course in those good old days we used to smoke in the classroom. He smoked his cigars, And we drank coffee, and he talked, and he taught. He taught the Shalom, he taught God in Search of Man, he taught various different books at various different times. And that was elective, and the people who took it were people who wanted to study with him. Those were great, great experiences. But the classes were difficult. And of course, we sort of rolled out of bed and into class at around 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. And I was sitting, it was what is now room 304, that large room, which was then combined with 302, could open up, and the big classes were in those two rooms together. And I was sitting next to the window, and I was looking out the window, and it was a March morning, kind of gusty morning. And I was just, he was going on about something with the Rambam, and I was looking at the traffic on 122nd Street. And suddenly, out of the subliminal, out of my unconscious, comes Mr. Gillman. And I jumped and I turned around, and I said, yes, Professor. And he said, Mr. Gillman, did you see the trees on Riverside Drive this morning? Rambam, trees on Riverside Drive. I said, he walked from your apartment on 114th Street down to the cemetery, presumably on Riverside Drive. We sort of rolled out of bed and brushed, went up to the 6th floor, crossed over and down into 304. So I said, no, Professor, I haven't. So he says, Mr. Gillman, he said, it's a pity. I said, really? He said, yes. He said, the trees on Riverside Drive this morning, they were wearing tefillin.
Tefillin?
Tefillin. What am I going to say to this? Yes. No, they weren't. She said, I guess so, Professor, you were there. He said, believe me, they were wearing tefillin. I said, right, Professor. I was just wanted to jump out the window, run out of the class. But I knew this was not going to be the end. There was going to be some more. So he says, Mr. Gillman, what are you doing after class? I said, I have some other class. He says, well, I will permit you. You can cut that other class. I want you to go to Riverside Drive, and I want you to look at the trees on Riverside Drive and bring me back the tefillin the trees are wearing. So I guess, there's nothing else to do. I obviously have to go to Riverside Drive. I would expect, that some illumination would come to me once I was there and looking at the trees, and I would understand what this is all about. So I walk up 122nd Street, get to Grant's Tomb, walk on the drive, I look at the trees, and I look and I look and I look, and lo and behold, this is March. At the end of every twig, there is this little brown thing that's shaped like a question mark that you used to open up and put on the tips of your nose. What's it called?
Earwigs?
No, there's a
Helicopters.
helicopter. There's a technical name for them. There's also a popular name. Anyway, but the effect was, if you looked at it with sort of Hasidic mystical through the klipa, you could see that in a sense they were like the tefillin shel rosh. They stuck out at the end of the tree. So this is the closest I could come to seeing tefillin on the trees. So I pick up 2 of these, figure 2, right? Walk back to the seminary, walk up to his office, and knock on the door, and he comes in, part the smoke, dive through the smoke. There he is behind his desk, with the cigar and a safer, and he looks at me and he says, so, Mr. Gillman, did you find the tefillin on the trees this morning? I said, produced my 2 little pots, and I said, felt so silly. Absolutely silly. I said, is this what you made? Wonderful, Mr. Gillman. Now you see that even God's trees wear tefillin. I said, yes. I say, I see. And he says, that's what I mean by radical amazement. I said, yes, Professor, radical amazement. I said, wonder, glory, the mystery, nature, awe, I said, all the words. I said, fine, Mr. Gillman, he says. And next Monday morning, Mr. Gillman when you sit in class, look at me, I'm not outside an the last word to Yocheved. Mrs. Heschel, would you like to say something at the end, after Yocheved? You don't know? No, after.
I was not a student of Dr. Heschel, but in 1967, in June 1967, after the 67 war, and I worked at the Anti-Defamation League at that time, the ADL came to Dr. Heschel and said, the Christian community, as Avraham said, the Christian community has no idea why all of us were gray during those months prior to that. Dr. Heschel, we want you who have this connection and understanding of the Christian community, and they have respect and honor for you. Could you please write about what Israel means to the Jewish people? And Heschel thought, and he said two things. I will put aside my work on the Kotzka, and I need somebody to come and help me. And to my everlasting delight, I was chosen by ADL. You finish your work in the office, then you go up to Dr. Heschel. And a few times a week I would come up, and I would write down what he would say, and I would be ears. He said, how does this sound? How does that sound? He would take out of his drawers, his file drawers, I called them, he was stringing necklaces with his words. Those 4 lines on a page or 2 lines on a page, and it came out as something beautiful. The books were all over the study, of course, and the telephone kept going incessantly, and he was always so polite to everyone on that phone. It was really incredible. It was a good lesson, too, one which I usually don't keep. Over the years, this was before Yochanan and I were together, and so that was my initial introduction to him was on my own. And I was very delighted when the book Israel, An Echo of Eternity, which was the book that Heschel wrote, came out. There was a very lovely acknowledgement to me. And later, when Yochanan and I got married, Heschel said, "You have made me a liar. I thanked Hirschlag, and now you're Muffs." Sylvia and Dr. Heschel couldn't come to our wedding because Heschel was then recovering from his first heart attack. But we have a beautiful, beautiful silver Kiddush cup from Mexico. That is my favorite Kiddush cup of all times. Two more things. Shabbat after shul here, very often we would walk down to Riverside Drive with Dr. Heschel, with Sylvia Heschel, with other people. And Heschel would have his Shabbos walk, which meant you would walk like this and stop with somebody, and then you take 2 more steps and walk. And it would take an hour to go from the seminary to 114th Street. Right? And one time, we were walking that time, and we were going very slowly, and he said, "Come up for Kiddush." And we said, "Dr. Heschel, we're having guests for lunch. At this rate, we'll never get that." He ran. The man ran across the street and into his house so we could have Kiddush with him. The last thing was the saddest thing, obviously. Heschel died between Friday night and Shabbos morning. And we were informed of it very quickly on Shabbos. We went over, and we were there the whole day, and Wolf was there, and lots of people were there. And Motzei Shabbat, there was an incredible mixture of people, which spelled out who Heschel was. You had, of course, his immediate families, Susie, Sylvia, you had Wolf, and, okay. And you had his mishpacha from Borough Park, the Kapitchnitzer Chassidim, his nephews and nieces. His nephews and nieces who every Erev Shabbos would call, how are you? Tante Sylvia, how are you? And I think they probably still do that. They were wonderful, wonderful people. Zisha and Rasha, all of them. And in that same room were Daniel and Philip Berrigan, the priests. The day before Heschel died, it was a stormy, rotten winter day. Heschel had just finished his manuscript of the Kotzke, or the Passion for Truth, of Kierkegaard and the Kotzke. And Heschel went up to, was it Danbury? Because one of the Berrigans, I forget if it was Daniel or Philip, was getting out of prison, where he had been for breaking laws in fighting the Vietnam War. And Heschel stood in the rain, waiting. And that night, I'm not saying that there was a direct cause, but his passion took him to places that could have been dangerous in that sense. And that Motzei Shabbat, there were the Berrigans, and there were the Kapitchnitzer, and there were the rest of us. And there was a man who combined for me what was so important. Yochanan spoke of Yiddishkeit and culture. I speak of the knowledge of, and deep rootedness in all Jewish studies, the Zionism, one of the first to speak out about Russian Jews, the social consciousness of not only about the Vietnam War, but the whole civil rights movement, all of these things which to me make up what being Jewish is, and I found it in Heschel, and we miss him.
I'm just going to say the hour is late, but to thank you all and to tell you that he thought about each of his students. He would come home to tell me, so-and-so understands me, so-and-so, etc., etc. And so I got to know some of the students through what he had to say. Also, there's so much I don't know where to begin, but I will just mention 2 or 3 things, perhaps. One morning, very unlike me, I went to the piano at 9 o'clock, and he was leaving, and I played some Bach. He came over, and he said, you know, I think Bach is Jewish.